Good. So I just wanted to say the way we work through the CommonSense American program, it's we will pick one issue per year. It's especially meaningful and ran for bipartisan action. Now, a rigorous process by which we go through to identify that issue. But by working that way, we're dependent on lots of others to have done the good work to kind of mature an issue. So, in a way, we cheat. We come in sort of late in the process when an issue is mature and looks like it might be getting close to being able to go through Congress, and then it feels like we can help boost it. And so we're just really grateful. Whenever we're working on an issue, there are lots of people who have been toiling for years to get to that. And Workforce Pell, that is particularly true. And that's true with organizations like the National Skills Coalition that have been working on this for years, and all these groups involved, and with members of Congress and their staff that have been working in a bipartisan way to get there. So I also want to thank Alison Dembeck for the good work that they've done in showing focus and thanks to member Scott. It really was just impressive to watch that bipartisan work unfold. Not just that they were getting along, but how high quality the substantive work was. And of course, Senator King over in the Senate, and a long line of folks have been looking for a lot of years to make this happen. And so all of you who have been working on it should take some solace that an organization of over 74,000 everyday Americans of the whole waterfront of policy we could work on, pick this as the most promising and meaningful bipartisan issue to work on this year. So our thanks and gratitude to all of you who have taken it this far. So the way to work some pretty more detail, once we pick an issue to work on in a given year, then we develop a thorough policy brief on that question. And our members commit to spend an hour or more per year on reviewing the brief on the topic that we pick. So it allows us to get into some details. So I'm not going to take a lot of time on it, but this is what the brief looks like that our members review. And these are policy briefs, not position papers. So we're not trying to tell the American people what the right concluding is, trying to give them good information to form their own opinions. And the core of that is to give the strongest speech for and against King Joe calls it. So in this particular brief, it starts out in the most general sense of, greater federal support for career-directed learning from Keith Allred and Fiesta. And then we work into more and more specificity, going into workforce Pell legislation generally, and then into all of the most active specifics under active consideration in Congress of exactly how you should do workforce Pell issues. So our members spend more than an hour a year reviewing that brief and weighing in. And so we're delighted today to have the initial announcement of the results of that. So to date, we've had a little over 2,000 of our members weigh in. And so I want to share with you what their views are. So starting again, we'll move from general to the specific. So at the most general level, support for federal government doing more to support career, and I get overwhelming bipartisan support at 87%. One of the interesting findings we think here is we asked our members not only do you support this, but what percentage of Democratic members of CommonSense American do you think support it? What percentage of Republican members of CommonSense American do you support it? And they vastly underestimate the other side's support. So essentially they're saying, yeah, I see the wisdom of this. People in my party will see the wisdom of this. I don't think people on the other side will see the wisdom of it. And in fact, everybody's in agreement to a far greater degree than they would think. We also asked them at the current levels of federal support for career-connected learning, is that about right? Too little or too much? And we had 79% thinking that that's too little. But if we've got about 40% of the country who seeks four-year degrees getting $112 billion per year in support, that $7 billion per year for the other 60% of Americans is probably not enough. So getting a little bit more specific, then on workforce Pell legislation, even just a tad higher bipartisan support at 88%.
And again, each side underestimating the other side's support. We also have in these results pages, and you've got the handouts with the QR codes so you can go right to this page yourself, but we have these dashboards that allow you to go in and slice and dice the data in additional ways that you might want to do that. I'll just show you, if you clicked on this one, that this is, sorry, just somehow it's not working. Of course, you practice it beforehand, and there we go. So here's the breakdown by party of the, do you support workforce Pell Grants? And I want to point out, so the overall support is 88%. So here's independents at 89%, Republicans at 88%, Democrats at 89%. Is that just somewhat striking in our polarized times? You really cannot tell the difference between Republicans and Democrats on this question. Then we also have additional results broken down by education, income, race, and ethnicity. And for the most part, as you drill into those, I won't go into all the details, the similarities are more striking than the differences are. The one notable piece is that generally people of color have slightly higher levels of support already, high levels of support overall as the average. And so going back to the overall results, then we get into the greater specificity of the questions about the exact provisions that should be in workforce Pell legislation. Of course, the central consideration occupying Congress has been, how do you put in adequate quality requirements that we make sure that the students that go to these programs don't end up worse off because they went into a program that they then don't graduate from, or can't get a job, or the job doesn't give them more income. So we got to make sure that they're good enough that they're actually getting something out of it, but not to overdo the requirements such that it just becomes unworkable and people don't have access. So what's the right balance there? And that's obviously what's been occupying much of the congressional debate. And so we dive into that in some detail. I won't go into all of those results here, but we'll summarize on that question of the balance. Certainly strong agreement by our members that there need to be good quality guardrails in place. We really don't want to leave these students worse off, that they've got student debt that they can't pay having done this program. But among the range of quality requirements under discussion, in general, there's a little bit of these all look pretty reasonable, but don't overdo it. A little bit of a sense that the risk is more in putting too many quality requirements in place rather than too little. So probably the central piece of that question that has occupied the congressional debate is, what do you do with for-profits? We all know that that's got the for-profit educational industry has a challenging history there, and that there's been abuses. And so what do you do about that? So I want to just go down to that level. I'll just say, as you go through the strong support for outcome performance requirements that's in the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Bill, strong support for the administrator approval criteria, strong support for the stackability and transferability pieces, and that so that our results line up quite closely with the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Bill. As we come down then to the question on for-profits, we ask the question in a specific way of, do you support excluding for-profits from workforce Pell Grants under various conditions of other quality requirements being in place? So if we start out by asking them to imagine that there are no other quality requirements in place, do you support excluding for-profits? And it's a pretty broad majority of 62% say, yeah, given that history that for-profits have, we really don't want to expose folks to that are going to get Pell Grants if you don't have any other quality requirements in place. But as you ask them to consider additional quality requirements and you layer those on, the administrative requirements and various levels of the outcome requirements, then you see that start to move towards more and more comfort with the for-profits. And when you get to the point, this would be the closest representation of the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act. If you have the administrative requirements and you have the outcome requirements in place to assure quality, then we have moved from 62% support for excluding for-profits to 65% opposition to excluding for-profits. So a flip of, no, there's a benefit to having for-profits out there as long as you have these good quality guardrails in place. The details on the dashboard here, I think, are particularly interesting. In fact, I'd say this is one of the most interesting findings we've ever had in doing this kind of informed polling. If you just look at the partisan breakdown, if you look at the condition under there's no other quality requirements, we see support across the board. Every group we can ask, majority support for excluding for-profits without those quality requirements in place. But we see about the only place that there's a big partisan difference is on this question. So 53% of Republicans say, yeah, probably shouldn't let them, but it's fairly split, and a much bigger majority of Democrats saying, yeah, don't let for-profits do this. And then if you look at on the other demographic results, you'll find that the opposition to for-profits, the support for the exclusion of for-profits, is particularly pronounced among people of color. So American Indian, Alaska Natives, not as much, but Black and or African Americans, Asians, and Hispanics. Now, if you go to looking at if we have the full complement of quality requirements in place, like the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, then we see opposition to excluding for-profits across the board. There is no group you can find that isn't majority opposition to excluding for-profits. And the difference between Republicans and Democrats has shrunk considerably from a 19-point difference to a 6-point difference. So as we get to putting those other quality requirements in place, then we find greater consensus emerging among the subgroups in the American populace. And as you go down to the other pieces, where we had, for example, among Black or African Americans and Asians, among the highest levels of support for excluding for-profits when there's no quality requirements, they're now the strongest opponents of excluding for-profits. So they have flipped the most of any group. And of course, they've often been the ones that have been most victims of for-profit excesses in the past. So they especially take comfort from the guardrails and say, if that's the case, then for-profits have something to offer. They're often in places where there aren't community colleges, for example, a little quicker to adapt to the market and the needs. And I say, hey, we want our people to have the benefit of that as long as you have the quality requirement. So overall, we see just ringing endorsement among everyday Americans for the idea of workforce Pell generally, and for a good range of the specific quality requirements under active consideration in the Congress, and particularly for the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act. It would be hard, I think, to construct legislation that could sort of align more with where everyday Americans are, not just where the House committee has been, where they have obviously done very good work together and listening to each other and coming up with a bill that on the merits can meet the needs and perspectives of each of the folks involved. So again, we're just awfully impressed with the nature of the work and people listening to each other come up with a substantive bill that can make a real difference in everyday Americans' lives. And our hats off to everybody who's done the important work. Thank you. And Katie, we'll turn it over to you.
As folks are sitting down, I'm going to use my phone so I get everybody's titles correct. At the far end, we're joined by Carrie Warick-Smith, who's Vice President of Public Policy at the Association of Community College Trustees. Next, Dr. Kayla Elliott, who's Director of Workforce Policy at the Joint Center. And finally, Alison Dembeck, Vice President of Education and Labor Advocacy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So I hope over the next 30 minutes or so, we can dive into a conversation that kind of builds on the information that Keith just shared with us. I think looking at many of the folks that are in the room, I'm going to tell all of you exactly what you already know when we start to set up the conversation. But I don't think it might be helpful for us all to be on the same page. So National Skills Coalition, along with the three partners up here and many other of our national partners who are in the room, some of the CTE organizations, some of the other community colleges associations, have worked for over a decade on developing policy recommendations that are consistent with some of the pieces that we see in the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, in the Bipartisan Jobs Act. And those recommendations and that work that the folks sitting up here and our predecessors and otherwise have done was built around the idea that right now our higher education policies do not always support people's access to the kind of training that businesses need them to have access to. And so thinking about what are the modernizations that we can urge Congress to be making that better supports a worker being able to get that credential that helps them get a job or helps them upskill in order to get a different and new job that's going to offer better pay or new growth opportunities. And the issue has never been more important than it is right now in our economy across the country. Due to federal investments over the past few years under the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, there's going to be, according to estimates that National Skills Coalition, Blue Green Alliance, and University of Massachusetts put together, 3 million jobs created every year over the next decade. That's on top of the openings that we hear from businesses that are working in manufacturing, in construction, in IT, where they're already looking for workers and where workers are desperate to upskill their skills to fill some of those jobs. And policy supports that enable that are at the heart of how we can help people succeed and businesses grow. So to build on that, I want to turn to our experts. And first, I'm going to ask each of you all to do kind of a top level. Why are you all working on short-term Pell? And for the constituencies that you all serve, where do you see some of the most pivotal and important reasons for Congress to be working to address and expand Pell Grants to support these high-quality short-term training programs? Allison, you're next. I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to build on what Katie said. None of it's going to be surprising, right? There are almost 9 million open jobs right now, and there are a little over 6 million people who are actively looking for work. Taking away the fact that even if we fill all of the empty jobs, we still will have jobs with everybody who is working. We will still have, several million jobs open. But every time I go and I talk with our employers, if I'm talking to state and local chambers, if I'm talking to our actual member companies in a room like this, if I ask them, hey, are you looking, who in the room is looking for jobs, right? About a third of them, at the very least, at a minimum, about a third of them will raise their hands and say, hey, I'm looking for a job. When I ask them, well, all right, so you're hiring. Are you having difficulty finding people for the skills that you're hiring for? Most of those same people leave their hands up because they just are not, there's a disconnect. And granted, I will say sometimes the employers aren't always good about saying what it is that they actually want in a job ad. Maybe they haven't really, honed in on it. But most of the time, it is actually that there is a mismatch between skills and what it is that the employer needs. And so something like the bipartisan Workforce Pell bill, what that does is it gets people skilled up quickly so that we as employers can hire them, and then we can then also continue to help them with their training and help build their skills. It starts on a career ladder, so it's not all going to be on the Workforce Pell system in perpetuity, but it does get people in the door. And I think that is something that our members, our state and local chambers, our businesses are really, really excited about.
That's such a good point that we're talking about something that is part of an overall workforce or skill building strategy and an important part. Kayla, how about you?
So I will, can you hear me? I feel a little, okay. Yeah, it's green. Good to go. So I am new to workforce work. For the last few years, I have been at the Education Trust as Director of Higher Ed Policy. So a very traditional take on post-secondary access, affordability, accountability, and what happens when someone leaves the K through 12 system. So why am I working on this issue? Because I work here now. I'm at the Joint Center now, and that is a part of my role. But it has been a deep dive and an expanding of my own like mindsets, beliefs, but also expertise, right? And so I think like I will draw your attention to the Joint Center's QR code, where I've linked a recent survey that we've done that really aligns really well with CommonSense American's work around the support for Workforce Pell, and specifically breaks that down across race, education level, income, gender, and other identifying factors. And there is overwhelming support for Workforce Pell for and by Black constituents in that study, and that is why I am doing this work, right? The Joint Center is specifically dedicated to the liberation of Black folks in these here United States, and it is my job to make sure that any and every policy that we endorse will do that. My concerns, which we'll get to later, have been addressed, I think, sufficiently in the Jobs Act version of all the bills floating around. But if you scan that code, there are two really key tables that I'll draw your attention to, the first one and the last one. And in that first one, you'll see that support for Pell is high across race, but the highest for Black folks is about 74%, right? Other people of color, it's about 73%. And then it's actually well above 2/3 for white folks, right? But it is not the most important thing. The most important thing is increasing the minimum wage. It's ensuring that that wages increase with the cost of living. It's ensuring paid access to maternity leave, family leave. It's ensuring medical benefits. And so like you're saying, like this is one of many things we have to do to ensure that folks have access to the types of like jobs that have a life-sustaining wage. But for sure, we see overwhelming support from the folks that we deeply care about and center in our work. I also think like our work supports it, right? So we've done a lot around the future of work in AI, and Black folks are overwhelmingly overrepresented in those positions and fields that will be lost to automation, right? And that was confirmed by our research in 2017 and another, I believe, Pew study, our McKinsey study in 2021 or so. And I think to prepare Black people for this current job and the changing nature of work, it is very clear that upskilling is needed. There's a lot of money. I don't have to tell you all this. There's a lot of money flowing through infrastructure and into new jobs and upskilling, but we have to ensure that we are addressing occupational segregation. Right now, I'm not sure whose study it is, but if things continue the way we are, right, if we put more money and create more opportunities but don't address segregation and racism, we create more of the same. So of all of those hundreds of thousands of jobs that are being created, only 4% of them will go to Black women in construction, right? And so it's looking at what's happening and asking how not only are we opening access, but ensure that we're opening access to quality, to jobs that will actually have a life-sustaining wage, and addressing some of the things we know to be true about segregation, hiring discrimination, and a number of other discriminatory practices in the process.
Thanks, Kayla. I'm sure while it is probably not surprising to many folks in the room, the fact that 4% of those jobs are going to Black women in construction just emphasizes how important it is both to be listening to Black students, but also to be creating and passing policy that helps support a broader access and addresses the racist and occupational segregation issue. Carrie, now for the institutions and folks with whom you work, they would be running these programs that we're talking about. Can you talk a little bit about ACC's work and yours? Thank you for having me as part of this conversation to show the institutional perspective. So I'm with the Association of Community College Trustees. That means our membership constitutes the governing boards of the United States community colleges. And the boards have the job of ensuring the overall health of the institution and looking at really the trends and what is coming in the future that will help community colleges continue to serve their communities. That's why we have it in our name. This has been a top priority for ACCT and our sister organization, the American Association of Community Colleges, which represents president for several years now, really since the beginning of the conversation. But there are two pieces in particular that I want to share about why kind of now this moment is so important. One, as I know everyone in the room is well aware, we saw dramatic decrease in enrollment really over the past decade, but then particularly during the COVID pandemic shutdown. And if you look at enrollment rates, we're starting to tick back up. We're getting about even, but there's really a shift shift in who is attending community colleges if you look at the breakdown. So one, a lot of the gains have been made for dual enrollment for students who are in high school. But then we're also seeing an increase in older students, in students who are, I'll say, returning to the education system, whether they're first time in post-secondary or have tried something when they're younger, that overall we're seeing the age of community college students get both older and younger, which means when you look at the average, it's still about the same. That's how math works. It's still about 27 or 28, but that in general, we're seeing a lot more younger students and also an increasing proportion of older students. And then we know that for our adult learners, that they are more likely to already have families, to be established on their own. They're independent students. They're not looking for a traditional educational experience. They're looking to get the skills they need to either switch careers or to advance in their current careers so that they can earn more money, so that they can have more of a sustaining wage. And that's something that now that we're seeing how life patterns are settling post-pandemic really makes this a moment for Workforce Pell. I think the other piece that we're looking at, Kayla mentioned a lot of the infrastructure jobs, but there have been, in the past Congress, in the 117th, we saw several new laws passed that are moving forward in infrastructure, clean energy. At our legislative summit recently, last year we had the Departments of Transportation and Agriculture. This year we had the Department of Energy. And, a lot of folks have said, well, why those departments? Like, why do you not just have the Department of Ed every year? And it's because there's so much change coming in the workforce, and that these federal investments that are running through these other agencies, as those programs are implemented, are really going to affect the jobs that are available in communities. And our colleges want to be ready with the programs necessary so that the hiring can happen and that we have the folks who have the skills that can work in these new and quickly changing industries. And part of that will be helping individuals who want to work in those industries be able to access those programs, which includes expanding the programs that Pell is able to be used for. I've seen a couple themes from what folks have shared, and one thing that's rising to the top is both an insinuation that we should talk now about some of the challenges or some of the safeguards that should be part of the legislation, but also a couple previews of a couple of those. So the business responsiveness that I heard folks talk about, as well as some of the connections to stackability, ensuring that people can build on these short-term credentials, as well as ensuring that they're going to lead to good jobs, depending on how you measure that, wages, completion. National Skills Coalition has for many years been working with states to help states define what a quality non-degree credential is. And so this is one of those areas where states are ahead of where the federal government is right now in supporting and identifying where should the states be investing their dollars to help support some of these quick training programs, lead to good outcomes, and help people get on a career pathway. So I want to build on some of the work that states have done and the conversation we've had, and talk with you all about Kayla, I'd like to start with you. You brought up some of the challenges and teed up this part of it. What are some of the safeguards that you think are important to have as part of short-term Pell legislation, and why are the issues that you want to bring up some of the most important?
Yeah, I think the provision in the Jobs Act excluding for-profit colleges and universities was particularly important for me for many of the reasons that Keith already listed, right? Like Black students, learners, and borrowers specifically have been scammed, right? Like there is no better way to say that by for-profit colleges and universities that have not only, right, like put them into programs that are not high earning, but actually made them worse off than they were before, because now they have a certificate or a degree, something they cannot use, and actually may have debt associated, right? So not only are they not earning anymore, they owe more as well. And we've seen that happen in traditional higher ed. Student debt is a real crisis, particularly for Black borrowers, whether they are students, families, whomever. And I do not want that to happen here, right? So any provision that limits that is a good one for me. And I will always have an emphasis there that any opening up of federal dollars should be based on outcomes and safeguards and provision and results, improving results at the program level, right? And so disaggregated data at the program level is what we need to track retention, to track job placement, to track completion, to track the things that we know are a quality program. And so those provisions for sure are necessary for our support, but also just for a good bill, right? Like for a good bill that we know is a good use of federal dollars, right? And good to students, good to learners, good to workers. I think all those things are.
One of the things that is interesting, and folks in the room probably see this, is that what I heard you describing was an exclusion of for-profits and collection of program-level data. So one of those things, some folks on the panel come down on a different side on, and one on the same. Alison, do you want to talk a little bit about where the chamber's position is and some of the work that you see as important?
Sure. So kind of starting maybe with similarities and then moving to the differences a little bit. On the similarity side, we 100% agree that the outcomes, the data, it needs to be out there, right? That there is no, and this is true, to be honest, not just with short-term Pell, but with all of higher ed. Any of you who know me know you probably aren't going to get through a conversation where I'm not going to mention the College Transparency Act. I mean, this is just the way, like I'm a broken record on this, as Paris is laughing because she can't get a conversation with me without it, without mentioning it. So, but the truth is these things are important. We don't have accurate data about any of these programs, not just the certificate programs, but all of them. And there are a lot of reasons for it. And the Chamber thinks that the College Transparency Act is the best way to go to deal with that, because we need to make sure that all students are being counted and that we are looking at the success of all programs. That said, there has been a lot of movement in the latest bill that Dr. Fox put out on higher ed. We have come a long way in our conversations about the student level data network, and that is absolutely key, right? And so really appreciate the movement that's happened there and look forward to continuing those conversations. Also think that the Bipartisan Workforce Pell bill does look at outcomes as well. Still think that College Transparency Act is the better way to do it, but being what it is, that's not how the bill is looking at it, but still important. That said, where we're going to disagree is on whether or not for-profit schools should be included. We do think that for-profit schools are important. There, as was mentioned earlier, there are communities where there isn't a community colleges. There are communities where businesses already, companies already have programs built out with the schools so that they can train and upskill and then be able to then hire those individuals once they've finished the programs. But those programs happen to be for-profit schools. From where we sit, it shouldn't matter what your tax status is. It should matter whether or not you're providing results. And as long as you have the results available and the data available, you can then determine whether or not, because we agree, we shouldn't be in a position where there's money going towards programs that are unsuccessful. We do want to see it on the programmatic level. We do think people should be able to make their own decisions. We support free enterprise, and that's sort of kind of making those decisions. That's what the data would allow. But it's important that the data are out there and that we're not making it difficult for communities who may not have access to a particular type of school to be able to still upskill the people who live there.
As much as I want to turn this into some flowing, exciting conversation, I feel similarities between what you shared. Carrie, can you talk about from your folks' perspective, kind of where does the balance sit around the safeguards that lead to quality? Yeah. So we represent community colleges. We do not represent for-profit institutions. I think 99% of our members are public. We have a handful, literally about 5 who are nonprofit, 2 years who are private. But generally, we're public institutions. Which means I get to fall a bit in the middle here on being a little agnostic, is the word I like to use, on the for-profit colleges. Obviously, as public institutions that generally have more affordable tuition, we would prefer to see students come to community colleges. However, we also don't want this very important issue to be hung up on that one piece. So, there have been negotiations over what the guardrails should look like for several years now. The community colleges are, strong supporters of their having guardrails. Most of the analysis that I've seen has shown that in general, over 85% of community college programs will meet the various guardrails, particularly in the Jobs Act, the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act. I think it's similar, but it's also much newer, so we haven't had as much time to dive in. But, we want to make sure as community colleges that the programs our students are completing are benefiting them. And that, and so for that reason, we're, supportive of having these guardrails, having the disaggregated information by program, and making sure that our community colleges meet those measures as well. I think for us, some of the challenges, particularly for some of the very small programs, is just figuring out where that data comes from. How do you analyze it? If we're going to look at multiple years together, students stop and start out, where do they count? So, there's a lot of nitty gritty data analysis to be sorted through there. But I think the top level is that we're supportive of guardrails, and we want to make sure that some of these in the weeds issues don't stop the overall program from moving forward, because we really feel that it's necessary at this time. Thank you all. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to have one last quick question for you all now before I'm sure there'll be others for you from the audience. And the first is, I think I heard all of you talk about the momentum, right? This has been a long time where community and technical colleges and businesses have been advocating for this expansion to Pell. Within the past year, there have been some significant momentum and steps forward. The Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, the additional proposals around Higher Education Act. So what do you all see as the most important next step, or what do you want to see in the next year that would make a good step towards implementation? And this could be either what you want to see happen here on the Hill with Congress, or what you think needs to happen in the field with colleges, with students, with businesses, in order to prepare for what, hopefully, we're talking about an implementation conversation next, and ensuring that implementation happens successfully. Carrie, I'll start with you. I could do a whole panel on implementation alone, because let's do that one in. Yeah, it's all right. Hopefully after a bill passes, if not before. So I think short and sweet for the Hill, it's pretty obvious that we need a floor vote on the bipartisan workforce bill here in the House, and then we need the Senate to get started on this conversation again. There was supposed to be a markup in August in the Senate on the Jobs Act. That got postponed, what now seems like indefinitely, based on issues not related to short-term or workforce Pell. So, I think that's a straightforward ask here on the House side. On the Senate side, we'd like to see that markup. We'd like to see what the Senate thinks about the House bill, and try to have that kind of cross-chamber conversation so that we really can move to something that eventually is going to go to the president's desk. And, and it's our top priority to see that happen this Congress and not feel like we're starting from scratch in January. So that's kind of the political side. On the implementation side, our institutions are very ready to do that. We started hearing the question, like, why hasn't this happened yet? We've come to DC so many years in a row now with this as the top priority, like, what's going on here? But also, they know that there will be a lot of work that has to happen on the institutional side. Many of these, these programs are, if they're on the non-credit side of the House, they're not interacting with the financial aid office at all. And we know that, in pretty much every version of this bill, the programs have to be they have to be operating for at least a year before they're eligible, which means if there are new programs that need to be started, particularly in some of these technologically STEM-related fields where things are moving very quickly, it's really institutions you think about which programs would we want to start now so that we can start that clock on a year program. And on the non-credit side of the house at community colleges, those programs have to break even. They can't have a debt. They can't pull resources from the credit-bearing side of the institution. They have to break even on their own. So that, those are some of the big picture things that colleges really need to consider. And even if they're not looking at new programs, they're just looking at the programs that have already been in operation for several years. It's how do we get financial aid offices ready to process these programs that aren't that because they are shorter, they're, if they're 8, 10-week, 12-week programs, they might be starting every 8 or 10 weeks. They're not necessarily following your traditional semester schedule. So there's going to be a lot of work on that financial aid end for colleges to get ready to do this. I think we saw something similar when year-round or summer Pell returned. It returned right in the spring, and colleges could technically start it, I think, 6 weeks after that law got passed, and most of them said, oh, it's going to take us, we'll do it for a couple, but, we really need to get the financial aid offices ready, and we really saw the full year later. And that's something that we've been working on. We have plans written of okay, once this passes, this is what we need to do to support institutions to help the implementation. But we've got to get across that finish line. But then know that in many cases, from the institutional perspective, getting the bill signed into law is not the finish line; it's the start line. It's a great way to put it, Kayla.
Yeah, can't have a conversation about Pell implementation without talking about what's going on right now, right? And the number of both students and institutions that are waiting on information that they simply do not have because of the delays with the new FAFSA, right? And the thing about the new FAFSA is that it finally includes changes to making Pell open not to workforce students, but to students who are incarcerated. And we have a lot of lessons to learn from current implementation of Pell. A lot of lessons to learn, I think, from the folks who advocated for reinstating Pell for incarcerated students, and a lot of lessons to learn from those bills, which did exclude certain institutions, right, for protective measures because they are particularly vulnerable. And so I think owning that and being very clear about what happens to students who don't have the proper information and to institutions who don't have the proper information in a timely manner. So whatever we need to learn from this situation, I think I want to start with that for sure. I also think that implementation doesn't just happen at institutions or in the Department of Ed. Implementation also happens in the community with students, families, and other stakeholders, schools especially, right? K-12 schools especially, and the numerous different training, tracking, consults, coaching, counseling. What are you doing after 12th grade programs, right? That also need to be caught up to speed, that also need access to information on how they're coaching students, that also need access to information as they are helping students figure out financially what makes sense for them as well.
It's such a good
I think that Carrie said a lot what I would have said. I mean, the reality is without the bills being passed, we can't start from where I said we can't necessarily talk about implementation. I think that there is so much more momentum now with the chairwoman and the ranking member of the Ed and Workforce Committee having really rolled up their sleeves along with staff, putting in a lot of hard work to make sure that so the Jobs Act is the Jobs Act, but that's been out there for a while, and that was something that was having difficulty moving in the House. So let's figure out what the next step is to get it moving. And that momentum has put everything on accelerate, which I think is really good. My hope is that acceleration continues on the Senate side. It's been a little bit of a disaster over there in terms of trying to get a markup. And so hopefully this will then get a House vote. We'll have some momentum over there. In terms of implementation, I think from the business community side, and our folks are already trying to do some of this anyway, and we're trying to have these conversations. It'll help going forward. It's also figuring out what do the conversations need to be between us and the community colleges, or us and the for-profit schools who are going to be eligible. What programmatic changes need to happen to ensure that not just do people pass with the certificates that they need, but that the programs themselves are providing the coursework that we need to actually like have those skills so that we are actually hiring people, because part of it is we want to make sure that these programs are successful. If the programs themselves aren't actually providing the coursework and teaching the skills, then at the end of the day, those programs aren't going to be successful. And so there does have to be, on some level, some collaboration with the people who are doing the hiring and the people who are doing the training. And so that's the other kind of piece of this that we've already started talking to. My guys are very, very excited about. And the hope is that maybe there will be, because sometimes, particularly in smaller communities, there is some resistance to making those changes by the schools. And so the hope is that maybe with this change in legislation and the creation of the short-term Pell programs, that there will be a little more ability to collaborate.
So I can keep going, but we have a few minutes left. Do folks in the audience have questions for the panel or for Keith?
Yeah, ours was really a poll of everyday Americans on the policy stuff. And so, but clearly that level of, really striking support and uniform across all groups of Americans across the political landscape is the basic thing that, I think the panel was capturing it, and Katie particularly in introducing the panel, that, we have an issue of lots of jobs out there that we can't fill, so a real break on the American economy, and 60% of Americans that don't seek a 4-year degree. And so are we investing in those with rising needs for skill levels, higher skill levels that don't necessarily require a college degree? So you both have a chance for the individual Americans, many who would benefit most can get upward mobility for this, get into meaningful, higher paying jobs without having to take on college student loan debt. And then for the American economy broadly, that it really would be a boost to the economy if we could fulfill all of these jobs out there. So that's clearly has to be what was motivating our members. A full waterfront of policy options that we might have picked, that they said, this seems like the most promising and meaningful one. And that the overwhelming support for workforce Pell legislation, that's what they think is at stake. That's why it matters so much and would be meaningful at kitchen tables around the country.
The other thing that I'd add to that is to look at the lessons learned and the models set by some of the states that are doing really innovative work in supporting these shorter-term credentials. We've been working with somewhere around 20 states to help define what a quality non-degree credential is, and several of those, both before the pandemic and then especially with some of the recovery dollars and cents, have created opportunities for students within their state to access these shorter-term training programs with state dollars. And one of the examples that sticks with me is Virginia. When they as a model, they've got Fast Forward program, which brings together these short-term credentials with other higher education policies in the state. And something like 80% of participants that went through those training programs had access to higher wages, yes, but also the first time in their careers that they had access to healthcare. And so you're looking at an impact on people's ability to access jobs, businesses' ability to fill those positions, but also to have some of those other components that help people succeed, not just in their job, but throughout their entire life.
This may be a little tangential from the question, but I'm so glad you brought up some of the other benefits. And this is something that I know I've had conversation with staff about and staff's predecessors about, if there is a way to work some of those quality measures in, and we just cannot find. So if anyone has any ideas, so I'm throwing it out there, a consistent data source to be able to measure things like, is this a job with benefits attached? Is this a job with consistent hours or a set schedule? And so, we've run across a lot of anecdotal examples of people saying, well, maybe my hourly wage is only $1 more, but I now have healthcare. I now have a retirement plan where my employer is contributing, and I now know that I am guaranteed 40 hours a week, whereas in my previous job, maybe I'm still going to be making more money than just $1 an hour because I wasn't always getting a set number of hours a week. So I think there are benefits that we struggle to measure that go with some of these career shifts as well.
Are there other questions and thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to Mars and Christina for your work, both getting the room and moving these issues forward. You could hear what a champion everyone here is for the momentum that you all are creating along with your bosses. Thank you to NICD, Holly, and Keith, and the rest of the team for working on this with us and bringing us a really important public opinion information that's really shaping and helping to support some of this momentum. And thank you to Seattle for all of the great work that you all are doing and set this conversation. And thank you also to my colleague Caroline, who did almost all of the planning to get National Field Coalition here for this conversation.
Thank you all.